3 weeks ago, my identical twin sister drugged me, locked me inside our basement, stole my passport, and flew across the world pretending to be me. She thought she was about to marry my fiancé and step into the life I had spent months building. But what she didn't know was he had already caught the lie before she even boarded the plane. He didn't stop her. He didn't warn her. He let her come anyway, because he wasn't waiting to welcome me. He was waiting to expose her. And by the time my sister realized the truth, she was already deep in a remote place, cut off from everything she knew, sitting across from a man who had been quietly testing her from the moment she arrived and already knew exactly who she was. People have been telling me my whole life that my sister and I are identical, the kind of identical that makes strangers laugh and ask us to switch places as a joke. But the truth is, we were never the same in any way that actually mattered. I was the one who stayed steady, the one who built things slowly, working long shifts hospital just outside Columbus, saving money, planning ahead, while Claire moved through life like it owed her something bigger, something faster, always chasing shortcuts that never quite worked out. And for most of our lives, that difference didn't feel dangerous, just distant, like we were living parallel versions of adulthood that barely overlapped. Until about 8 months ago, when I met Daniel through an online medical outreach forum, a place where healthcare workers shared cases from rural areas. And he stood out immediately, not because he tried to impress me, but because he didn't. He was a veterinarian working in a remote northern region where most people wouldn't last a week, and everything about him felt grounded, intentional, real in a way I wasn't used to. And we didn't rush anything. We talked every night for weeks, sometimes about work, sometimes about nothing, building something slowly enough that it felt like it could actually last. And eventually, those conversations turned into plans. Not fantasies, but real, detailed steps, paperwork, travel, timelines, things that required effort, patience, commitment. And I remember the first time we seriously discussed me visiting him. I sat at the kitchen table going over documents while Claire moved quietly around the apartment, not saying much, just listening in that way she had when she wasn't bored, but focused. And at the time, it didn't feel strange. She had never shown interest in anything I was building before, so I didn't think to question why she suddenly noticed details, why she started asking small, precise questions, like what kind of visa I needed, or how long the trip would be, or what documents I had already submitted. Questions that felt casual on the surface, but carried just enough accuracy to make me pause for a second before brushing it off. Because when you've known someone your entire life, you don't expect them to study you. You assume they already know you. And over the next few weeks, those moments kept happening. Small things that didn't feel wrong until much later, like her picking up my phone once and asking why Daniel preferred messaging at certain hours, or her noticing where I kept my passport without me ever pointing it out, or the way she would sit nearby while I read his emails, not interrupting, just present, like she was quietly collecting pieces of something I didn't realize she was building. And looking back now, the hardest part isn't what she did, it's realizing how long she was preparing for it. Because none of it started the night she drugged me. It started long before that, in those quiet moments I ignored, in the questions I didn't take seriously, in the way she watched my life unfold like it was something she could step into whenever she decided she was ready. If you want to see what happened next, stay with me. And if you like stories that reveal what people try to hide, don't forget to like and subscribe. The envelope showed up on a Thursday afternoon right after a double shift, the kind where your body feels heavier than your thoughts and all you want is quiet. And I almost left it unopened on the counter because I already knew what it was. Daniel and I had been working through the paperwork for weeks, step by step, nothing rushed, nothing careless, just slow progress towards something real. but something about seeing everything finalized in one place made it feel different, more solid, like the plan had crossed the line from someday into something that was actually happening. And I remember sitting at the kitchen table reading through the itinerary, the invitation letter he had arranged, the dates, the confirmations, every detail we had talked through so many times, now sitting there in black and white. And Claire was behind me, closer than usual, quiet in a way that didn't feel like disinterest anymore. It felt like focus, like she was paying attention to things she had already memorized. And when I told her everything was finally approved, that I'd be leaving in a few days, she smiled in a way I hadn't seen in a long time and said we should celebrate, which should have felt strange because she had never supported any of this before. But I was too exhausted and too relieved to question it. So I said yes. And that night, she ordered food, poured wine, moved around the kitchen like nothing was wrong, like we were just two sisters having a normal evening. And I remember thinking, maybe I misjudged her. Maybe she was finally happy for me. And the first sip tasted slightly off, just enough for me to notice, not enough for me to stop, because exhaustion makes you trust things you shouldn't. And the next clear memory I have is waking up on something cold and hard, my head pounding so violently it felt like my thoughts were breaking apart, the air thick and stale. And when I opened my eyes fully, it took a few seconds for the shapes to make sense. Concrete floor, metal shelves, a single dim light. And then it hit me all at once. I was in the basement storage room, the one with no windows and only one door. And when I forced myself up and grabbed a handle, it didn't move. It was locked from the outside. And panic doesn't explode, it builds slowly as your brain starts putting together pieces you don't want to accept. My phone was gone, my bag was gone, and when I tried to remember the last clear moment before everything went dark, it was Claire standing across from me, watching, not angry, not rushed, just certain. And that's when the truth settled in, not as a shock, but as something colder, something that made too much sense too quickly. She hadn't just acted on impulse, she had planned this. She knew exactly where my passport was, where I kept my documents, how I spoke to Daniel, what details mattered and which ones didn't. And I started pounding on the door, yelling her name until my throat burned, trying to force it open, scanning the room for anything I could use, anything I could break. But there was nothing except time stretching out in a way that made every second feel heavier than the last. And it wasn't until the next morning when the noise finally carried far enough for my neighbor to hear and force the door open that the final piece fell into place without anyone needing to say it out loud. Claire wasn't in the apartment anymore. She wasn't missing, she wasn't hiding, she was already gone, already on that flight carrying my passport, my documents, my name, and walking straight into a life she believed she had studied well enough to steal, without realizing that the one person waiting for her on the other side had already started noticing the cracks before she even left. If you want to see what happened next, stay with me, because what she walked into wasn't the life she expected. It was something far more controlled and far less forgiving than she could have imagined. And if you're drawn to stories where the truth slowly catches up to people who think they've gotten away with everything, don't forget to like and subscribe. By the time Claire's plane touched down, Daniel had already made up his mind about one thing. He wasn't going to confront her at the airport. He wasn't going to accuse her over messages, because suspicion isn't proof, and whatever this was, he wanted certainty. So he met her like nothing was wrong, calm, polite, controlled, the way you are when you're watching something closely instead of reacting to it. And from the moment she stepped into his car, he started testing her. Not with obvious questions, but with small ones, things we had talked about months ago in passing, details that don't sound important until you get them wrong, like how I take my coffee or the name of the first stray dog he ever treated, things I would have answered without thinking. And Claire tried. She repeated what she's seen, guessed at what she didn't know, filled silence with confidence. But lies don't collapse all at once. They thin out, they leave gaps, hesitation, timing that feels just slightly off. And with every mile they drove deeper into that remote stretch of land,
farther from the nearest town, from any easy help, from anything familiar, Daniel grew quieter, not because he was unsure, but because he was becoming certain. And that night, after hours of watching her try to exist inside someone else's life, he asked one final question over dinner, something simple on the surface, but specific enough that there was only one real answer, something we had shared in a moment no one else had been part of. And when Claire paused just for a second too long before answering incorrectly, that was it. Not dramatic, not explosive, just the exact moment the lie stopped holding together. And almost at the same time, miles away, I finally reached him through our message thread using my laptop, sending a photo of myself, time-stamped, explaining everything in one clear message. And when those two truths met, his suspicion and my proof, he didn't raise his voice, he didn't argue, he simply set his fork down, looked directly at her, and told her he knew she wasn't me, that he had known something was wrong before she even boarded the plane, and that the reason he hadn't stopped her was because he needed to see how far she would take it. And for the first time since this began, Claire had no script left to follow, no detail left to borrow, just silence and the realization of where she actually was, a place hours from anywhere, sitting across from someone who had already taken control of the situation without her noticing. And he gave her a choice, not out of kindness, but out of control. Cooperate, hand over everything and leave quietly, or explain the situation to authorities in a country where identity fraud doesn't get handled gently. And for the first time in her life, Claire didn't push back. She agreed, because the illusion she had built was gone, and all that was left was the risk she hadn't planned for. And within 24 hours, he arranged her return, documented everything, and flagged the situation so she wouldn't be able to use my identity again without consequences following her. And when she came back, there was no confrontation, no dramatic apology, just distance, because some lines once crossed don't lead back to anything familiar. And as for me, I filed a full report, replaced every document she touched, secured everything she accessed, and made one decision that mattered more than anything else. I stopped thinking of her as someone I needed to understand, because the hardest truth was realizing how closely someone can watch you, study you, memorize you, and still never actually know who you are. If this story stayed with you, make sure you like and subscribe, because sometimes the most dangerous people aren't strangers. They're the ones who think they can become you without ever earning the life you built.